February 1st, 2021. With me today will be Senator Olson calling in. Senator Wielechowski is going to be online. Here in the room, Senator Wilson, Senator Hoffman, myself, Stedman, Senator Bishop, Senator Ron Imhoff are at other meetings, other issues they're dealing with. So they won't be attending the meeting today. We're going to continue overviewing the governor's proposed budget that he proposes every year by December 15th for consideration for legislative action. We're going to walk through the agencies at a high level today, and then after we conclude that presentation, we will then have legislative finance come forward, and they'll walk through their presentation of the overview of the governor's submission with some changes and fund sources and some fund timing to set the stage for the upcoming budget analysis and compulations that will be done at this table. Later in the week, we're going to have some more overviews as we continue to set the stage. We will be putting together the subcommittee for the operating budget over the next probably 2 days, and hopefully the subcommittees will be underway by the end of the week. And we're going to diligently work through this process and try to come up with some conclusions and solutions for the structural deficit over the next month and a half, 2 months. So with that, I'd like to invite Mr. Neil Steininger, Director of Office of Management and Budget. He is the administration of the Governor's Budget Director. So if he can introduce himself for the record, who he represents. I think he's going to start on slide 11, and we'll go until the normal conclusion time at 10 o'clock, excuse me, 11 o'clock, and we'll have a discussion with the committee members to see if we want to continue on after a short break, because their floor session is a technical session today, or we want to pick it back up at 1 o'clock. So I'll leave that up to the committee members at the time, and we'll see how far we get in the next 2 hours. With that, Mr. Director, if you could take it away.
Thank you. Good morning, and for the record, Neil Steininger, Director of the Office of Management and Budget. We're starting here on slide 11 with the Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development. And just to kind of familiarize the committee and those watching with these slides, prior years, 2020 and prior, are inclusive of appropriated supplementals. So it gives you an idea of the total amount of resources that a department had available to it in any given year. FY21 is reflective of the current appropriated budget that department is operating under. So without any proposed supplementals, what we at OMB call management plan. And 22 is the proposal that we've put forward. Most of these graphs do not include duplicated funds. However, on a couple of slides in departments where that's material to the way the department operates, we have included that. And anywhere where there are other notes, I'll try and point out anything on those slides and the history there for you as we go along. So within the Department of Commerce, Community, and Economic Development, high-level changes. We've transferred the Alaska Development Team from the Department of Commerce to the Office of the Governor. That's 2 positions and about $240,000 in UGF. And what that does is elevates that economic development activity, to a cabinet-level position. We've also eliminated the last remaining unrestricted general fund named recipient grant that exists within the Department of Commerce. When you look at those historical years, that dark blue UGF, that's a significantly higher in prior years. There used to be a lot more named recipient grants that flowed through the Department of Commerce. The last one remaining was to the Alaska Civil Legal Services. They also receive another named recipient grant that doesn't come through unrestricted general fund. It's a portion of court receipts that are designated by statute that go to this organization. So this isn't the only money received. However, this was the last discretionary grant in the Department of Commerce budget. We've also deleted a vacant position in the Department of Economic or Division of Economic Development. You'll see this throughout a lot of agencies where we've asked agencies to look at positions that were vacant, 6 to 9 months or greater, that they didn't have plans to fill, that still had funding in the budget, and to kind of trim up those positions that aren't necessary, that they haven't been filling for quite some time, and that they don't intend to fill in the future. Again, that's a couple more positions. That's Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation's 3 PCNs that meet kind of similar criteria. And we've replaced the last unrestricted general fund within the Alaska Energy Authority with power cost equalization funds. This removes the last of the UGF subsidy to that organization. And we've added 2 Regulatory Commission of Alaska utility master analyst positions. This just allows the Regulatory Commission to better meet its needs and better meet its objectives, and that's utilizing receipts generated by that organization.
Okay, so on the second to the last bullet, dealing with the power cost equalization fund, is there any issues with that concept?
Chair Stedman, so this is a use of a designated general fund for a purpose that isn't specifically designated by statute. However, the Alaska Energy Authority, its broad mission does relate to the things for which the Power Cost Equalization Fund was intended, for ensuring that there's access to energy throughout the state. And so while it's not specifically within the designated purpose in statute, that designated purpose is not there's nothing to bar the appropriation of power cost equalization funds for this purpose, and we feel there is a nexus there.
Okay. In the bullet above it, dealing with Alaska Gas Line Development, I think there's some proposal that's going to be worked on in the near future that may be of significance dealing with the gas line. Is that correct?
Chair Stedman, that's correct. Elsewhere in the budget, there's authority allowing for the Alaska Gas Line Development Corporation to receive federal or other receipts, what we call statutory designated program receipts, to receive those receipts for the purpose of the first phase of the Alaska LNG LNG pipeline project.
So that's a much bigger policy issue. So I'm pretty sure that the committee members will want to have a separate discussion on that whole topic as we go forward. Any questions on the slide from other members?
So in the Department of Corrections, you can see this is one of the areas where over the last several years there's been continued investment. You'll see that in all of the public protection related organizations and agencies, that these are areas where decisions have been made to invest further. Going into fiscal year 22, there's roughly $4 million associated with CRC beds, that's community residential centers, I believe, as well as adding GPS tracking for the residents in those facilities. We're also utilizing federal and municipal, what are called man-day receipts. This is effectively a per day charge that's assessed for federal inmates that have committed federal crimes that are housed in state facilities, as well as inmates that have committed municipal crimes housed in state facilities. For those that have been tracking the Department of Corrections budget, you may know that when we went to reopen the Palmer facility, we were able to utilize an excess of these federal man-day receipts in order to avoid general fund cost there. The department generally collect a bit more in federal mandates than they had been budgeted in prior years. So we're able to make this shift over to utilizing it on a more ongoing basis rather than building up a surplus of those collections. And this just offsets general fund costs within those institutions. We're also replacing insufficient restorative justice account funds. This is transactions that occurs every year. This fund is collected from permanent fund dividends that would have otherwise been paid to people with felony convictions that make them ineligible to receive a permanent fund dividend. That money then goes to several places in the budget. However, it is a pretty volatile source of money because the number of prisoners and the amount of the dividends change year to year. This year, collections on that fund are significantly lower than they were in the prior year. But the prior year, they were significantly higher than they historically had been. So you'll see this type of transaction every year fluctuating up and down. We're also restoring positions within the Palmer Correctional Center. They weren't needed initially when the facility was started to be brought back online. However, once it is fully open, these positions will be necessary for operations.
We have questions. Senator Wilson.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Steininger. Was the money that was appropriated through some of these funds, through the federal municipality receipts, was that enough to offset sort of the cost of reopening Palmer, or was more GF needed?
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, the federal mandate money covered a significant portion of the cost. There is some unrestricted general fund associated with reopening Palmer as well, and there will be in the out years to operate the facility. I don't have that exact number off the top of my head though, but we can get you that.
Thank you. I think what we should do is have Senator Wilson chair the Corrections Subcommittee budget. I think he's in a good position staff-wise and with his background to help us with that. So no good question goes unpunished at the table. Other questions on corrections? Okay. Next slide, please.
This slide represents the Department of Education early development without the K-12 formula. We'll have the K-12 formula on the following slide. You can see a pretty significant peak in the light blue, which represents federal receipts. That is money coming in through CARES Act and other COVID relief legislation from the federal government that has been passed through and gone straight out to school districts for the most part. Within their operating budget, there's a couple of small changes. Changes to travel and reducing staff, that again, long-term vacant staff, travel reductions as a result of just expanded use of teleconference meeting technology. There's a handful of vacant positions within the libraries, archives, and museums that have also been eliminated. And there's a data assessment contract that they found that they were already able to produce the data that the contract provided in-house. So that won't be continued. And other just miscellaneous travel reductions and contractual reductions are able to implement through changes in how they handle telework.
Questions on this slide? Just a brief comment. When we get into the subcommittee, we'll have them take a look at the libraries, archives, and museums due to the lack of tourism in the state last year and potentially this year on the impact of any revenue that may not have materialized, and their progress in trying to, when that industry comes back, to try to integrate it, or not so much integrate it, but get more of the visitors industry cycling through our museums and libraries for generation help in their budgets. So we'll work on that. Okay, next slide, please.
This slide represents the spending on formula programs. Primarily, that would be the K-12 foundation formula, money that goes out to school districts for operations. but it also includes a couple other smaller formula programs like the residential schools program. Changes within these activities, the residential schools program has one school that's been approved for quite some years but never was actually implemented within the Anchorage School District. So the school district has affirmed they don't intend to implement this program, so the authority associated with it has been removed. One thing to note is while that authority has been in the budget in prior years, it didn't get spent because the school never implemented the program. Regarding the foundation formula, it's been fully funded. Changes in student demographics this year have reduced the estimated amount to be paid out in that formula. You can see in the table on the bottom right, that represents kind of a high-level picture of that student count and how that distributes into the basic need requirements and the funding levels. At the top, you can see a pretty significant reduction in regular ADM, that's average daily membership. So reduction in the number of kids in classroom traditional learning, but a pretty significant increase in the number of kids that are receiving learning through correspondence programs, which are funded at a lower level than regular ADM because they're not in the physical facilities. So there's a net reduction of about $20 million to the foundation formula, despite being fully funded.
Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, do you know the decrease in student population count for this next year?
Through the chair, Senator Hoffman, the decrease in total ADM is just shy of 2,000. It's the third row on this table. But if you want more specifics on those counts, I would probably have to defer to the Department of Education, who actually collect those numbers and do a deeper analysis on them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would request that you give the committee at least a 5-year analysis of what the student population has been doing for our information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And with that, Senator Hoffman, before we go to Senator Wilson's question, it'd be nice to have the committee briefed on the status of the schools currently and their challenge in having the young Alaskans passing their exams. There's been quite a bit written about that lately, and the concern is students falling back in grade levels or missing huge components of the particular grade they're in now in K through 12. So we'll have to take a look at that also, I think, Senator Hoffman, and try to get a feel for what's going on. That is one of our most fundamental responsibilities of the Constitution, is education of our children. So that's a big issue here at the table. Senator Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The regular ADM, is that just on the point in time count, or is that counted throughout the year?
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, so the regular ADM, this is based on projections done in the fall based on those counts. I know there is a true-up period later in the year that the Department of Education does, but I think for more specifics on when and the timing of those counts, I think Department of Education could give you a pretty good rundown of how that happens.
Any other questions on this slide? Go ahead and continue.
This is the Department of Environmental Conservation. Again, this is another area where a lot of effort has been put into finding savings within administrative services, within finding areas where telework and change in service delivery over the last year has found ways that we can save money that are sustainable in the long term. There's also a change to a fund source used for shellfish testing. Currently it's being funded with head tax receipts. We're proposing to utilize unrestricted general fund. And a reduction to spill prevention response account authority. This account collects significantly less than it's budgeted to expend. And so this reduction is necessary just to ensure that the fund itself does not get emptied in the near future. So this is part of a plan to taper down use of that fund in order to ensure that it remains solvent.
Okay, next slide.
In the Department of Fish and Game, you can see a pretty significant uptick in the light blue in the graph on the top. That reflects moving some of the what's called Dingell Johnson and Pittman Robertson funds from the capital budget into the operating budget. Historically, they've always been just in the capital budget. However, a lot of those funds are used to support operational costs within the Department of Fish and Game. So you'll see increases. There's also been increases in those grants coming from the federal government. So you'll see an increase in the operating budget reflecting those funds being budgeted where they're really being expended. We also have a proposal to replace unrestricted general funds with commercial fisheries program receipts. They've generated enough receipts that they can offset some of the unrestricted general fund in their activities. There's also, when you look at the Fish and Game budget in the budget bill itself and in some of our reports, you'll see a change in the structure within the commercial fisheries division. We've consolidated the regional components into a single component, and what that really does is it just allows for some administrative efficiencies for them to be able to manage the money. There's a lot of activity that individuals, staff that cross between the different division or different regions, and tracking that in the budget system in addition to in other areas, generated some kind of redundancies in that tracking. Doing this allows them a little bit of administrative efficiency, and they can still report on how much activity is being done in each region. There's also the impact of legislation from 2018 that reduces the salaries of the Commercial Fisheries Entry Commission commissioners, and that results in about a $42,000 reduction.
Okay, I think we'll have some discussion at the table dealing with the Dingell Johnson funds and that whole concept of moving it out of the capital budget. We may not agree with that. We'll see how that goes. The other concern is with Fish and Game, along with Department of Natural Resources, is that we need to keep our industrial base going, our resource extraction base, and if we don't have enough operational funds in DNR and Fish and Game, we don't have our citizens working around the state. So we'll take a good look at that. We have Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Director, on the second bullet point, where you're proposing to consolidate commercial fisheries regional components, what does that all entail?
Thank you. Through the chair, Senator Hoffman. So it's really more of a technical budget change that we're looking to implement. So what it entails is shifting the money from the various regions into a single component. Currently, they're in separate budgetary components within the same appropriation, or allocations within the same appropriation. Shifting them into a single component or single allocation just simply avoids a lot of accounting transactions associated with taking staff that work across the across the regions. So, one biologist may have projects in multiple regions. They have to then charge their time not just to the different projects, but then have that assigned to the different budget allocations. The accounting structure has to match that allocation structure. So this allows a little bit of accounting efficiency, allows a little bit more flexibility for that staff to not have to worry about shifting money between the regions, as that staff member may spend more time on the northern region versus the central in a given year. So it just gives them a little more flexibility. However, there's still that project level tracking for those biologists, so you can still see what regions they're working in, and you can still see where the projects are and what's being funded throughout the state.
And Mr. Chairman, one final question on the first bullet point. the replacing general funds with commercial fisheries program receipts. In the past, I know that the commercial fisheries program receipts have been used in a variety of ways, but basically to get more information so that the department can better decide allocation issues. And I'm concerned that taking those funds away from their current use is going to put additional hardship on adequate information to make the necessary allocation decisions. And I'm wondering why we are looking at targeting the commercial fisheries and not looking at sports fisheries issues. And I think that although sports fisheries does provide a lot of jobs, so does commercial fisheries. And commercial fisheries is a much larger component and has a bigger financial impact to the citizens of the state of Alaska that are heavily dependent upon adequate information to make sure that the maximum allowed fisheries are harvested, that turns any fish that unnecessarily may go up to spawn are monetized. So that whole decision there may be a little bit short-sighted in the long-term economy of the state of Alaska. So I would take a strong look at what we're trying to do here. You know, I know it's monetary, but we do have a constitution to follow to manage our resources in an adequate manner. And if it means that general funds need to be utilized, they should be utilized. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And we might be considering you as the subcommittee chairman of Fish and Game. Senator Wilson. I won't assign other duties if you ask a question. Okay, we have any other questions on this slide? Wait, next slide, please.
This is the Office of the Governor. Within the Office of the Governor, we have what I mentioned earlier on the Department of Commerce slide, the transfer of the Alaska Development Team in. We also are eliminating the OMB analyst chargeback rate. This was implemented about 2 years ago to charge for OMB analyst time. That has generated more work than it has benefit. In addition, we're also implementing a change in the way that we handle charges for central services across departments. So things like within Department of Administration, you have things like the Office of Information Technology or Shared Services that deliver services on behalf of other agencies and then have to charge for those services. Those charging rates are quite volatile year over year because they're just based on actual costs of what's going to be incurred. We're looking at setting those charges in advance using lagging averages, but that requires that there's a little bit of money there to ensure that if those estimates are off by a little bit, they can be accounted for. We're proposing to utilize lapsing general funds from the prior year to create a buffer to ensure that that averaging doesn't create detrimental impact to programs or to those central services. But this provides other agencies that are providing direct services assurance of what their bill for their central services will be, so that it doesn't, mid-year as they're working through their operations, create a surprise billing where they have to, make pragmatic decisions within their budget just based on something outside of their control. So we're trying to rein in some control over the predictability of some of those internal functions of the state bureaucracy. And so that would exist within the Office of the Governor, since we are not a central service agency and we can monitor those activities.
Any other questions? In the spirit of reining in expenditures, should we not consider eliminating this department?
Chair Simon, I would not recommend eliminating this department. Feel the services
I'll
provided are
that
essential.
subcommittee. Next page, please.
So Health and Social Services, these graphs represent the department without Medicaid. The next slide will represent Medicaid expenditures, but this gives you a little bit of a view of the non-Medicaid portion of the department. You can see a pretty significant spike in the light blue, and this represents funding coming in from the CARES Act and from other sources for COVID support is primarily what that spike is. Significant changes in the department. The Division of Public Assistance is definitely the best example of an area where the move to telework and the challenges around operating government functions with COVID has resulted in finding significant savings. So as they sent staff home in a lot of their paper-heavy work processes, they found that, well, that doesn't work well because you have all the paper that you need to access. So they need to find a solution to that. And they were able to find a solution that actually saves a lot of time out of their workflow in the way that they are scanning and processing those documents. After working through this, they found that they can reduce both the 20 PCNs that were added to just address backlog within that division, as well as another 101 PCNs. One thing to know, within this division, they have a pretty high turnover rate in this type of staff. So as they work through implementing these changes, they don't intend to lay anyone off. The plan is to make these reductions over the course of this year and next year as they have turnover and to reduce these PCNs through attrition and get them down to a stable staffing load that is able to do the work with all of these technologies that they've implemented. We also have a couple of smaller reductions, reduction in the cost of postage. The Division of Public Assistance sends a lot of mail, but moving to a lot of online services has allowed them to save a significant amount in postage. Within the Office of Children's Services, they're replacing the Circle of Support grant. This is a program that goes out into households to work with families, to sort of do preventative work with families that may be part of that OCS Children's Services umbrella. And they're replacing that with more direct casework rather than a grant out. This allows a reduction in the amount of state general fund dollars, allows them to claim federal dollars, but still allows that activity and that direct intervention into households and help with families to occur. We also have seen an increase in subsidized adoption and guardianship. This is $2.4 million increase in federal receipts, but this means that there's more children going into permanent homes, into adoptions or guardianships, and out of the foster care system. So while it is a budget increase, it's a metric that is positive to see increase.
Great. Questions on Hess? For those watching at home, we'll be taking a look at this department. There's another slide coming on Medicaid. Senator Von Imhoff will be chairing this subcommittee. It is one of our biggest challenges here at the table, is controlling the overall cost of this. And we will be looking at the offsets of the COVID funds, federal funds, and keeping an eye on what really are the underlying numerics, so we're not surprised when the COVID money disappears. So we'll be tasking her with several duties concerning this department. Go ahead, next slide, please.
So this slide, the graphs on the top represent changes in the Medicaid program. Also, a couple of quick bullet points on non-Medicaid related items. The Division of Juvenile Justice is eliminating positions associated with the Anchorage School District Step-Up program. This is where Juvenile Justice was sending staff into Anchorage schools. This activity will be handed off to the school district for performance by their staff. And we're also eliminating a handful of vacant juvenile justice positions. None of these are positions that are actually in the homes. These are positions that are kind of on the other side of the business within juvenile justice. In the Medicaid program, we're utilizing lapsing general funds that are available due to a temporary increase in federal match. So during the COVID pandemic, the federal government increased the match in the Medicaid program significantly, saving us roughly $14 to $15 million per quarter. So utilizing some of that unrestricted general fund to implement a cost reduction in FY22 saves us money in the FY22 budget, but also really sets a number within the Medicaid program that we need to work towards. It makes it a lot easier to work with all the various parties, third parties, subject matter experts, federal partners, if we know what we're working towards. So this gives the department a glide path and a target to work towards over the next year. As we all know, changes in the Medicaid program are complicated and time consuming. So having some certainty into the future of what they're working towards really helps them work with those partners to get to where they need to be. There aren't specific items related to this reduction, but it is a short-term cost savings now, but also a target in the future of where we'd like the Medicaid program to be.
Senator Wilson.
Yes, thank you. And I'm assuming this is the FMAP rate. Was it like a 6% temporary increase to our FMAP rate? And do we know how long that's going to continue on for currently?
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, I believe it was a 6.2%, and it goes through the end of the calendar year.
Go ahead.
As a follow-up then, do we know if how any of our waivers are faring and how that may take a part into this Medicaid budget, if they're going to continue on with that, or is this what's going to be the cost reductions with the continued 6.2% decrease?
So through the chair, Senator Wilson, the waivers that had been granted prior to the pandemic, the department still is working on those. During the period of the COVID pandemic, the Medicaid program, changes to the Medicaid program have been severely restricted. So we can't make any changes to eligibility, to the service population, or to the benefits during the period of the pandemic. So existing waivers that were discussed prior, those are still working on. Anything new that they may have worked to implement over the last year has had to be kind of put on pause.
Another follow-up?
Yes, just a follow-up. Is that a restriction by the state or the feds? And for how long will new waivers be put on hold? To the end of the federal pandemic or the end of our state emergency disaster declaration?
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, that was a restriction from the federal government, and it's for the period that we're receiving the enhanced federal participation rate.
Any other questions on this? So what you're telling us is it'd be very difficult for us to make structural changes to this program until after the pandemic has passed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that some of these changes, these one-time funding mechanisms, you're hoping that in the future that dollar change could be then materialized into a structural change to hold that budgetary reduction?
Chair Stedman, that's correct. So the concept here is that since we know changes can't be made now, and we know that changes, even when they can be made, take quite some time, setting the expectation with a longer time horizon, provides us some certainty in those negotiations necessary to make the changes. But yes, in the short term, changes to this program can't be made.
So should the committee then be anticipating some statutory changes coming forward by the department to help in this, or what's the opinion and the status of the department in helping us identify and solidify these reductions?
Chair Stedman, I would defer to the department on specifics, but they are working to understand what will need to be done in order to actually effectuate the change. Like I said, changes in the short term aren't possible because of the federal restrictions and a lot of the activity that was being put into, looking at how to implement some of these cost saving items within Medicaid was put on the back burner while the department really focused on COVID response. So as they're able to, they'll pivot to and renew some of those efforts, and at that stage we'll have more information about that direction.
Okay. Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the last bullet point, it seems as though the administration is proposing using temporary federal funds to supplant the general funds for $35 million. So is it the administration's position to identify particular programs that are going to be funded by the federal government, and after those have been identified, then the changes come into play? So we will see at least an idea of where the administration is contemplating changing the statutes. Is that a fair interpretation? Because the other solution could be not identifying those and leaving them as carte blanche on a $35 million allocation to the a large supplemental process. So what can we anticipate? Is there going to be targeted utilization of the federal match to supplement general funds or not?
Through the chair, Senator Hoffman, the federal match increase is across the entire Medicaid program, so it isn't necessarily targeted to one service in the Medicaid program or another. It's just an increase in that base, what was 50%, and has been increased by 6.2%. So it's not within a specific area in the Medicaid program. The reductions that we would implement come fiscal year 23 in order to meet this $35 million reduction target. Those, as they're developed and work through with those partners, the specifics on that would become available at that point as we figure out what can be implemented.
Mr. Chairman, if I might continue, the problem that I see with this is that if the changes are not made, statutory changes are not made, we have an obligation to fund those programs. And in 23, fiscal year 23, if those changes aren't there, then we have to come up with general funds to the tune of $35 million. And it's going to look like an increase to the budget where it really isn't an increase because of the actions we're taking here today. So, and if you identify Medicaid changes, those changes are going to take place over time. They don't happen overnight. And this administration is going to be here for the proposed 2023 budget. So people should realize that and be aware that reckoning day is coming.
And to that point, Senator Hoffman, we're going to be spending a little bit of time with the next presenter on that conversation, how the options that the committee has in trying to position the state due to our cash burn rate. There is some concern that if we have too much optimism and reductions that don't materialize a couple years out, we're going to have less ability to maneuver to meet our budgetary needs, and that will just mean more tax burdens on the public. So we're going to have that conversation starting with the next presenter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Any other questions on the slide? Next slide, please.
This is representing the Department of Labor and Workforce Development. Within the department, there's a reduction in general fund match for the basic support federal grant. There's a reduction in the match requirements, not actually reducing the amount of money that we're choosing to match a static program. So this allows us to use less general funds to match the same federal award. They also have distributed throughout the department a lot of very small commodities, travel, and office reductions that add up to $214,000. And they're eliminating 2 or 3 vacant positions, 2 administrative positions and 1 research analyst that have been vacant for some time with no intention to fill.
Senator Bishop isn't here today, so for punishment for that, he will be assigned the Department of Labor as the subcommittee chairman. And he's a past commissioner, so he should have an easy time dealing with that budget as far as concepts go. So go ahead and continue.
In the Department of Law, this is another agency that has seen some increases over the last several years as we've tried to bolster prosecution as part of public protection investments. This year, you'll see $3 million in unrestricted general fund spread throughout the criminal division of the Department of Law, and this is to increase staffing to ensure timely processing and prosecution of sexual assault and abuse cases. You'll also see in the supplemental budget, which we'll discuss on a later date, another $4 million appropriation associated with really kickstarting some of these efforts to get through prosecution backlogs. We're also seeking partnerships with home rule communities to support prosecution of misdemeanors. That's about $1.3 million spent in the criminal division, where the state is prosecuting misdemeanors for communities that have the legal authority to prosecute the misdemeanors themselves. There's a couple of communities within the state who already do this activity in-house, so to speak. We're looking to create cost-sharing agreements with those communities who have the authority to do this activity but have chosen not to, and the state has come in and picked up that activity to ensure misdemeanors are prosecuted. This would not result in the state stopping the prosecution of misdemeanors. We're simply looking to cost share with those entities that have the authority to do so.
That's caught some of the community's attention, and I don't think they're too enthusiastic about it, so we'll have to have those discussions as we move forward. As referenced, they might have the legal authority, but there's some differences of opinion here in several directions, so we'll sort that out as we go forward. Also, with this department, we need to keep an eye on the directional change politically of the federal government dealing with our natural resources, and we need to be reasonably comfortable that the Department of Law is in a position to defend the state and the rights that we have given us in statehood. So we'll have those discussions also. Go ahead and continue.
Within the Department of Military and Veterans Affairs, you'll see in the budget history a pretty significant increase in unrestricted general funds on that first row. One thing to note, though, is that's a bit of a misnomer. Last year, we transferred the State of Alaska Telecommunication Systems and Alaska Land Mobile Radio, the SATS and ALMAR programs, from Department Administration to DMVA. And so that's really where that significant increase in unrestricted general fund spending came from. So not really a true increase, but an organizational change. We're continuing that organizational change by merging those two programs into the Alaska Public Safety Communication Services. They've always been managed sort of together for the last several years. And so really this is just acknowledging that single unit that program, those two programs really serve a singular focus. Also within the department, we're eliminating a handful of positions that have been vacant for quite some time with no intention to fill. That is a reduction of 4 PCNs. And there's a couple of areas where reductions can be made based on just investigating prior year spending and that work that we expect departments to do every year, investigating what they're actually spending, what they need. Department of Military Veterans Affairs has identified just shy of $200,000 they can reduce.
So how come you didn't take it out last year?
Chair Stedman, that's a good question. I don't think they had identified it last year to reduce.
Okay. Any other questions on this one? Okay. Next slide.
Within the Department of Natural Resources, you can see a reduction in unrestricted general fund since a peak in fiscal year 15. Couple of changes within that department this year. So we're looking to utilize lapsed fire suppression funding to support fuel mitigation and the cutting of fire breaks. Right now, this year has been a very low fire year, so we're expecting that at the end of FY21, there will be some money left over that we normally budget for fire suppression activities. So we'd like to utilize that money to do fuel mitigation activities and hopefully have lower fire years into the future. There's also a $250,000 investment in park ranger law enforcement. Really, this is to ensure that they have current and are able to replace back stock on things like vests and different equipment that they use in the field. We're also offsetting some UGF costs within the divisions of oil and gas as well as mining, land, and water by utilizing program receipts that they've collected, and an analysis of their collection history shows that they can support the divisions with a little bit less of a unrestricted general fund appropriation. And there's also the reduction of or a reduction of $100,000 UGF, but it's really just truing up an increment from last year for federal plan review, that as they've done those activities, they realized they didn't need as much money as they asked for and were appropriated last year. Another note I forgot to mention on this slide, while other slides have included supplemental appropriations, this slide does not include the cost of fire suppression because it is wildly variable and would kind of detract from the ability to see trends in DNR's funding.
Thank you. In past years, we've had a quite significant cost in fire suppression. We get about, 75% of that could be reimbursable back from the feds. Do we have any idea of when those funds might be returned back to us?
Through the chair, Senator Wilson, the process for getting federal reimbursement on some of those fire costs does take several years. So there is quite a bit of a lag from sort of the state's budget process to when we receive those federal funds. So prior supplementals are sort of set at the amount that at that stage we believe will require from unrestricted general fund, but there is that true-up period that takes some time, and the Department of Natural Resources tracks that federal funding coming in and can provide reports to show you how much reimbursement we've actually received for prior fire years.
Okay, go ahead, next slide.
In the Department of Public Safety, again, you can see investment in public protection as you look at this graph and see increases in unrestricted general fund over the past couple of years. In this year, we have about $1.7 million in unrestricted general funds. There were positions added in last year's budget, but funded at about 75%, just in acknowledgement of the time it takes to recruit new troopers. They wouldn't be brought online day one. However, those troopers are being recruited actively, and the department believes they'll need the full funding going into FY22. They believe they'll have all the troopers fully recruited. But also within the department, you see a lot of reductions in non-law enforcement staffing, changes to travel and commodities, really a lot of the implementation of, remote connection video conferencing and other contractual savings that we've been able to identify over the last year. There's 2 vacant building plan review positions that were created but have never been filled, and the department intends to eliminate those positions as they don't plan to fill them.
Okay, go ahead and continue.
In the Department of Revenue, you can see that this department, very small amount of unrestricted general funds in comparison to the other funds. Those other funds, so they represent the management of the state's financial resources. So that's management fees on investments that we have. But you can see a decline in those amounts going into 22 as ARM Board, the Retirement Management Board, is able to implement about $10 million in investment management savings through the way that they handle those investments. We also have restructuring of the way that we charge for management of some of the state's funds. So rather than using unrestricted general fund to pay for management of those funds, the department intends to charge the fund that it's managing for the cost of managing that fund. So you see a reduction of about $1.4 million in UGF and an increase in the fund sources coming from those funds they manage. Within the Division of Child Support, their current case management system is a very old legacy management system on the state's mainframe, which is expensive to maintain. They're moving to a web platform as an interim step to modernizing that case management system. There's an associated capital project request that goes along with this that's the money system. There's an associated capital project request that goes along with this that's the money to actually implement a new case management system so that they can move off of the legacy dated system that just it requires replacement. There's also elimination of 3 vacant positions and implementing a change in the rates and their ability to collect federal funds for indirect costs. In the Alaska Permanent Fund Dividend Corporation, we've included the implementation of incentive compensation for their investment managers at an estimated maximum cost of $890,000.
So this has been around for several years, so is this a new position from the administration, or?
Chair Simon, on the incentive compensation plan. So Chair Stemmen, the incentive compensation plan is something that's been discussed for several years. And, at this point, yes, we're supporting the implementation of the plan. And it's been many years that the corporation has been advocating for it. And we see the value in implementing that plan for staff retention purposes.
Next slide.
In the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities, you'll see a fairly significant shift, though it may not show up necessarily on this graph. This graph, and in this case, this graph does include duplicated funds. The purpose of which is because the Department of Transportation and Public Facilities, a lot of their funding comes from capital projects that show up into their operating budget as duplicated funds, and also they manage the Division of Facility Services. There's a division that has informally existed for a couple of years as we've been centralizing maintenance of state facilities. In this budget, we formalized that division in the budget structure, so you can see the maintenance of state facilities and separate it out on its own. This also includes transferring the remaining public building facility activities that existed within the Department of Administration. and transferring those into this new division of facility services so that they're all managed and housed under one roof. This is an area where we're utilizing a large amount of one-time money from the CARES Act. So one of the aspects of the CARES Act was funding from the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, that went to the Department of Transportation and can be used for operational costs of state airports. So we're able to displace a lot of unrestricted general funds used for maintenance of state airports and replace with federal funds. Those federal funds won't last forever. The federal funds we're discussing here likely will expire at the end of fiscal year 22. However, they're in subsequent federal relief packages, more money has come in for some of these purposes that can displace costs at Department of Transportation. So we're still investigating how we can utilize that federal funding most effectively. In this situation, it's allowing us to keep some money in state savings accounts rather than expending it, but we do acknowledge it is a short-term situation, and we'll have to find a way to fund these activities going forward. Within the Alaska Marine Highway System, we proposed, we're looking at sort of a baseline level of essential service. This brings us to the level that we proposed last year in the fiscal year 21 budget. We also have a projected shortfall in motor fuel tax, which requires backfill of about $500,000 in unrestricted general fund.
I'd like to thank we've got one more slide, I guess.
Yes, and this was at the request of Co-Chair Bishop, just where the school bond debt program is budgeted. We funded it at 50%, which is the level that was funded in fiscal year 2020. And that represents about $12.5 million in unrestricted general funds and 29.3 in designated general funds. Associated with this, there's a fund capitalization of the regional educational area or attendance area fund, also at 50% of the statutory calculation.
So just as a reminder, as I recall, the last couple of years, the Finance Committee here has recommended full funding of the debt reimbursement. And so we're not in policy alignment with the administration on this subject matter. We'll have those discussions again at the table and include even the broader debt issue, full debt around the state. And decide as collectively as a committee what position we want to have and forward it on to the Senate floor. It may or may not align with the administration's position. This is an area that if we change our policy direction, we should have statutory changes in place. In other words, we should do the analysis and the public discussion and potential change in policy direction uniformly amongst the administration and the legislature. We don't have that on this. So, with that being said, we'll take a look at this, factor it in our budget process, and whatever the committee decides, the committee decides. But we recognize that the administration's position on it, it's clear. Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bonded debt in this is a real debt that has to be paid. So when we are reducing the state's commitment by 50%, basically it's a cost shift to local governments that are, with COVID and all the other problems that they are facing, is going to be very difficult for them to address. And many of those districts, depending on their financial position, are going to have a very, very difficult time in absorbing the unanticipated increase to their budget, because the state is reducing its obligation that I believe is statutory responsible to pay. So, for one, I would agree with the chairman. If the administration wants to reduce the school bond debt in this by 50%, the administration should submit legislation to do so.
We'll go on to the next subject.
So in this slide, the graph and the numbers at the top represent state assistance to the retirement program. We've proposed legislation that's associated with the way this is financed, but that can be discussed in relation to that legislation. However, it simply shifts the costs from this state assistance line item within the budget and allows for charging to federal programs. A couple of other statewide items that didn't fit on any of the other slides. The Community Assistance Fund is funded based on a statutory calculation, which puts about $12.4 million into a deposit in that fund. The oil and gas tax credits are funded as a statutory minimum, using $60 million of ADA receipts.
And that is a subject matter we'll take up at the table, using ADA receipts and the funding of that. But that's a decision appropriating body makes. So we'll have that discussion So you have some updated slides, some requests that the committee had made. You can run through those if you could. And then some of the information that's going to be presented here, the committee may want to even have legislative finance do some work on some of these subjects and for further clarification as we try to sort through the policy issues for a foundation of going forward. Slide number 1.
So this slide is just correcting an error that we noticed as giving the presentation on Friday. So these are the budget cost drivers that I discussed. The state retirement, the state assistance to retirement increase was misstated on the prior slide. So this just represents that about $173 million in UGF reductions from 19 to 22 were required just to maintain a flat budget over that time period.
Okay. So just for those listening at home, so we basically get up in the morning and we're up 200 million just to start. Okay, next slide.
Slide 2, at the request of Senator von Imhoff, we've added the statutory permanent fund dividend to what's called the swoop graph, just to show its size in relation to other agency spend.
Senator Natasha von Imhoff, this
We'll
is
have
fake
legislative finance
news.
Go ahead and add numerics to
Quit
this,
putting our PFD fund
and maybe even percentages
on the
on
graphs.
table.
It does not belong there.
So as a reference sheet for all the committee members and aides, so you can see the magnitude of the different departments when we start talking about reductions. Okay, next slide.
Slide 2, at the request of Senator von Imhoff, we've added the statutory permanent fund dividend to what's called the swoop graph, just to show its size in relation to other agency spending.
Okay, so we'll have Leg Finance go ahead and add numerics to this and maybe even percentages in a table. So as a reference sheet for all the committee members and aides, so you can see the magnitude of the different departments when we start talking about reductions or what have you. I think it'd be beneficial to have percentages in dollars, either in a table format or on the slide.
So slide 3 is also as a request of Senator von Imhoff to add the permanent fund dividend payments to the slide that was showing a summary of State of Alaska operating budget. So this has been updated to reflect State of Alaska total budget inclusive of both the permanent fund dividend as well as capital budgets in those years.
So we're looking at, on the total line from 21 to 22, a significant increase.
Chair Stebbin, yes, on the total line, because in fiscal year 21, the appropriation for the permanent fund dividend did not follow the statutory calculation. There was a significant change in 21 to 22 for that payment, because in 22 we've proposed the statutory calculation.
And does that include the extra $2 billion on top of the $3 billion extraction from the earnings reserve in this?
Looking at this slide, it does not appear to include that in the FY21 column. No, it's only included in the FY22 column is what that appears.
So that extra, just for clarity for those watching at home, it's hard to see on some of the slides. So the added draw to the permanent fund above the 5%, which is roughly $3 billion. The additional draw is another $2 billion, if I recall, in round numbers. Is the 3 or the 5 showing on these rates of change from 21 to 22?
Chair Stedman, this is showing proposed expenditures in fiscal year 22, not necessarily how the revenue sources come in. This is looking at the expenditure side of that for, an illustration of the proposed sources of money and draws that would be on slides that we were depicting our fiscal summary and depicting its impacts on state reserve accounts, which would have been a different slide in the early stages of my presentation.
Okay. So we're 1.4 billion roughly net change from 21 to 22 on total.
Chair Stedman, yes, that's correct.
Okay. The committee, just for those watching at home, the committee is going to spend quite a bit of time trying to pay attention to our cash position and our burn rates to see how to try to basically fix the problem before it fixes us. In other words, fix the structural deficit before we run out of cash. So we have other questions on this, and Ms. Chart, and I'm going to work with Ledge Finance to clarify some of this, especially for the public, so when they look at the documents, it's readily apparent what it is. My concern is a lot of times we generate stuff for our use and the public can't get much information out of it when they look at it. So we'll work on some of that clarity. Maybe we'll need more footnotes or what have you. But we want to make it very clear how much money is coming in and how much money is going out. And obviously the fund sources of where the funds are coming from and where they're going. And we're going to be watching basically the cash flow numbers. So if we, I guess we'll go on to the next slide.
Chair Stedman, this slide was produced at your request to show a comparison between what we had presented as the first 5 years of our 10-year plan, with comparing that side by side with what a status quo would reflect. So on this slide, one thing to note in the fiscal year 22 column, the blue slide is our proposal from our 10-year plan. The brown side is a status quo. Our proposal identified sources for the surplus, coming from a draw from the earnings reserve and a small draw from the CBR. In the status quo side, we're not reflecting those sources since it's just a status quo and that deficit's greater than the balance of the CBR. So under a status quo scenario, a source for that money would need to be identified. But when you look in fiscal year 23, 24, 25, you can see a difference in that deficit that while our proposal of moving to a 50-50 PFD and some of the budget reductions that we've proposed in the operating budget this year, as well as some of our planned targets in future years, doesn't close the entirety of that surplus or of that deficit. However, you can see that it does close a large portion of it, about $600 million portion of that deficit.
So we want to close the deficit sooner than later. My concern is in the blue so you want to land, if I interpret this correctly, at about 3.6 billion in operating agency expenditures. And if we don't attain the 400 million in budget reductions, we're going to be 2 more years into this and even a weaker cash position and with less flexibility to solve the problem. So I'd like to have the committee consider that those 400 million reductions are not obtained. And what are we going to do? I have yet to see, and we've requested and asked the department or the administration for policy change recommendations that come before the committee, legislation or what have you, to materialize this 400 million. We've also expressed interest amongst our colleagues, that if they have ideas for reductions to bring them forward. It takes a while to get through the legislative process, even if you're successful, and most of them aren't successful because they don't work and they don't materialize through both bodies and a signature by the governor. So I think it'd be frankly a mistake to assume that we're going to deliver $400 million in reductions when in the last 4 years there's been virtually zero. When we add back in, take a look at the legislature, the governor's office and the courts, and start putting everything in a pile. We've just basically been treading water, and the reductions we've made have been eaten up by other increments. So we, in good faith, 2 years ago, took some recommendations from your predecessor, OMB, and they were all added back 4 or 5 months later. Last year's budget was pretty much a status quo. We took that, worked on trying to get some expenditure reductions, and you can see that in the historic numbers now. And this year, I think we need to clearly recognize that the ability for us to reduce 300 or 400 million is minimal, and we need to prepare the state for that inevitability and not just ignore it and hand the next governor less cash in a big hole. So we'll be asking legislative finance to unravel the one-time fundings, including COVID, so we can take a look at how ugly the problem actually is and get it in the middle of the table, and then start having the hard conversations. Are we going to loot the permanent fund? Are we going to tax the citizens? Or are we just going to start closing down departments? And as referenced earlier from the OMB director, he is not interested in closing down the governor's office. And I'm sure that there will be equal resistance from all other departments. And if we can come up with reductions, this committee is open for business and we're ready to listen, but they've got to be deliverable. And as referenced by Senator Hoffman, not added back into supplemental 4 to 5 months later, because we frankly don't have the cash position to diddly-daddle around for another 2 years. So we're going to have some hard decisions, hard discussions and some tough decisions at this table this winter. And I'm hoping that the Senate Finance Committee will lead in that solution. And it's not going to be endless dividends for everybody with no taxes in a world of utopia, because it doesn't exist. We've got to deliver services, deliver a dividend, and not deplete the state's fiscal position for future generations. So that's the balance we have to try to achieve at the table. So we'll take the 3.612 as your target in good faith, but until we see concepts in front of this table that are reasonably attainable, we would be, in my opinion, foolish to go down that road, assuming that they're going to materialize. So again, don't misread what I'm saying. I'm not saying don't bring forth reductions. All subcommittee members or chairmen will be asked to review the subcommittees and bring back changes to hold down the costs that are deliverable. But I expect some small changes, but nothing significant that's going to make our issue or our problem go away. So that's kind of the direction I'd like to see the committee go. Each committee member has their own opinions, and we'll work together collectively, all 7 of us, along with our colleagues, to try to solve this problem. But if there was 300 or 400 million in reductions that are attainable, I think we'd already have those proposals on the table. submitted in legislation, or at least talked about in concept form very seriously amongst the caucuses. And as far as I know, they do not exist. So I do appreciate the hard work that the administration's done on the 10-year plan. Fortunately, we're going to throw it out the window. We're going to take a look at a 2 to 3 year plan and try to get us out of this mess. And we want to work with OMB, and we will target 24 or 25, FY 24, 25 for a base number, whatever. I'm kind of open to some of these, the rough target frame that we're going to look at in back 2-3 years. But I'm not interested in looking at what we did 10 years ago when Senator Hoffman and myself left these committee chairs with $16 billion in savings sitting in the middle of the table. We come back 10 years later, the money's virtually gone. There's nothing but a big hole. So we were able to craft a significant savings plan a decade and a half ago that put the state of Alaska in the strongest fiscal position of any state in the union. And now we sit here as one of the weakest. And we need to change it. And we need to protect the integrity of the permanent fund while we do it for future generations. And you can argue from multiple directions on the permanent fund, but the most conservative position that you can take in the permanent fund is sitting right there on the wall. And that's money into the corpus that can't be spent by the legislature without a vote of the people. So I am not interested in a solution that just liquidates the permanent fund. It's not a solution at all. So we'll have those hard decisions in front of us, and we're open to all ideas, and hopefully we'll, over the next 2-3 years, work our way out of this mess. And we're going to have the governor's bill on his recommendations of the dividend rewrite. We'll have that on the table. We'll talk about the math, the 50-50 split, I'm sure there will be some changes, modifications, if we can make that work. That would be good, because clearly that is a significant portion. We can't fix the problem without dealing with the 40-year-old formula. The math just isn't there. So we'll be reconstructing some of these documents, looking again back 2-3 years, or 3 or 4 years, and then forward roughly about the same. And get everybody working on trying to get the problem solved. As another brief note, I think this committee has the experience and in a better position and more geographically dispersed than any committee in the building. Clearly more experience than any other committee in the building to deal with this situation. So all of us will chip in and work collectively together and try to come up with a solution. So with that, we'll go on. If there's no other comments on that, we'll go on to the next slide. But just remember that number, that 3.6 billion. I don't know if that's going to materialize or not. I rather doubt it. So we're going to do our best, but we'll see. Let's go on to slide number 5.
So slide 5 was produced at the request of Senator Hoffman to compare various options for impacts of various permanent fund dividend proposals. So at the top, you can see the available revenues. Below, you can see various options for those proposals between current statute, then moving to the proposed 50-50 dividend into the future. Another showing that proposed 50-50 happening a little bit earlier. I believe that was part of the nature of the question that was asked on Friday. What's that timing aspect and how that impacts the proposal, as well as at the bottom just showing based on what was appropriated in fiscal year 21 and what that looks like going into the future, again, at the request of the committee.
We have questions on this. We'll work on some of these alternatives as we go forward, and probably more, dealing with the 50-50 split and the status quo. What I'd like to do is, collectively with the committee, is work a full range of options so all committee members can see what the likely outcome is, financial position is of any political position they want to take. So they're informed on the impacts of whatever policy they want to advocate for. We're all free to advocate for whatever policy we want, including liquidation of the permanent fund, which will be problematic at this table. So, do we have other questions on that? Okay, so I'd like to thank the OMB. We've got one more slide, I guess.
Yes, and this was at the request of Co-Chair Bishop. Just a summary table showing all of the departments consolidated together. His question had been, I believe, adding up the PCNs from each of the slides and not coming to the same total that we had on the department operating level slide. The reason for that is we didn't have independent slides for the legislative branch and the judicial branch. And so when you add those in, that resolves a discrepancy in the numbers that he was asking about on Friday. But this shows you PCN changes from 19 to 22 by department, just summarizing information from earlier slides.
And that's pretty much reflected in our budget. It's pretty much flat for all practical purposes. I think a flat employee count and relatively flat. Any other questions for OMB Director before he runs out the door? Seeing none, I'd like to thank the Director for coming in. I know we're going to have some differences of opinion on policy. That's just normal. We work collaboratively together with OMB, and for those watching at home, Ledge Finance and OMB synergize a lot on the financial information. There's very little disagreement between the two, so we spar back and forth a little bit here and there, but on the holistic view of the state, we're pretty much lined up. We have a little difference of opinion from time to time how to get to solutions, but the goal is to eliminate the structural deficit through budget reductions or other revenue replacements or something. We can't operate like this for another decade. It just doesn't work. So with that, the committee, would you like to take a quick break, or do you want to just roll right into Ledge Finance?
Roll right in.
Okay, we'll have Ledge Finance come forward with all enthusiasm. If you could. Okay, we'll have a brief at ease.
This is the most expensive.
Appreciate the brief delay. We're just changing presenters. We now have before us Mr. Lexi Painter, Legislative Finance Division Director. So for those watching at home, he is the Director of Legislative Finance, which is the legislature's nonpartisan financial arm. So he tries to deliver the information straight up to the legislature as far as political leaning, left or right or down the middle. So we're going to go ahead and have him walk through the governor's proposed budget. I've asked Ledge Finance to take a hard look at any one-time funding issues so we can clearly identify them and work with a base number as we try to close this fiscal gap. So, Mr. Painter, if you could introduce yourself for the record and take us through, and we're going to stop at noon for a break, lunch break, and finish up after that.
For the record, Lexi Painter, and I'm the Director of the Legislative Finance Division. Before I get started with the presentation, typically when we do our overview, we introduce the LFD staff. Due to the pandemic, they're not in the room, but I think they're all online. So I'm just going to quickly go through our analysts and their assignments, since it's changed significantly since last year. So as the Director, I am the analyst for the Governor and Legislature's budget. Our operating budget coordinator, Kelly Cunningham, is also the analyst for the Health and Social Services budget. Our capital budget coordinator is Michael Partlow, and he is also the analyst for the Departments of Environmental Conservation, Military and Veterans Affairs, and Transportation and Public Facilities. And then I'll just go through everybody else in alphabetical order so nobody's feelings are hurt by the order. So Connor Bell is the analyst for the Departments of Natural Resources and Revenue. He also took over a role I used to fill as our fiscal modeler, so please direct fiscal modeling questions to him. Morgan Foss is returning as our analyst for the Departments of Corrections, Fish and Game, Law, Public Safety, and also she handles fund tracking and is our retirement expert. Sabrina Javier is our analyst for the Departments of Administration, Commerce, Community and Economic Development, Labor and Workforce Development. She is also our fiscal note coordinator. And Kelly O'Sullivan is our analyst for the Departments of Education, the court system, and the University of Alaska. And she also prepares our fiscal summaries and handles many of our statewide items. So we have an experienced team. Several are in new roles from last year, but all have quite a bit of experiences with the state. Okay, with that said, I will get started. So we're going to kind of break this up into 4 sections. The first will cover the structural budget deficit. We'll talk about legislative finance's budget baselines for FY22, and then the governor's proposal as compared to those baselines, as well as the supplementals, and then we'll talk about the governor's 10-year plan. So our current year, fiscal year 21, is the 9th straight year of fiscal deficits for the state of Alaska. Oil revenue in FY21 is projected to be the lowest since FY78 in nominal terms. That's the year that the pipeline began operating. In real terms, which is inflation adjusted, it's the lowest that we've seen since the beginning of pipeline construction. The unrestricted general fund budget has been reduced significantly. In FY13 at its peak, it was $7.8 billion. In FY21, it's down to $4.5 billion, excluding the dividend both times. That's a 43% decrease. However, despite these major reductions, our budget reserve balances have dropped from over $16 billion in FY13 to about $900 million at the end of the current fiscal year. And as a result, the general fund is projected to owe the CBR $12.9 billion at the end of FY21 as a result of borrowing to cover those deficits over the past 9 fiscal years.
Just if you can pause there, just for a brief note for those at home, the debt owed to the CBR automatically gets, excess funds at the end of the year automatically gets swept into it, but there is no interest charge and there is no timeline. So, but technically the money is owed.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman, and that results in the general fund sweep, which to the CBR, which we've talked about at this table quite a bit over the last few years. So this graph shows our UGF revenue from FY12 to FY22, and it does not include the permanent fund, either POMV or the dividends. So this just gives you an idea of the level of decline. You can see that in FY12, the last year we had a balanced budget. Petroleum revenue was nearly $9 billion. That dropped down in FY15 to under $2 billion. Today, it's under $1 billion. So there was a brief increase in FY18 and 19 where it went back up to about $2 billion, but it's now down under $1 billion of petroleum revenue. And that is a leading cause of our fiscal situation at this point, is what you see right here. Going to the next graph, this shows how our budgets have changed over this same period. From from FY12 to 22. This does include the dividend. So you can see the peak year for agency operations was actually FY15. Agency operations peaked at about $4.5 billion today in the governor's proposal. In FY22, it's about $3.8 billion. Statewide items actually peaked in FY14, and the capital budget peaked at over $2 billion of UGF in FY13, which is why that's our high budget year. We'll get into some more detail on agency operations in the next couple of slides. This one puts the two together, again, just showing FY12 was the last year of balanced budgets, and then the deficits thereafter. This does show that the legislature enacted a significant deficit filling revenue measure in FY19, which is the percent of market value draw from the permanent fund, and that significantly reduces the deficit from where it was before, but there's still been a deficit in each fiscal year since that was enacted. Going on to the next slide, again, this is showing the budgets. This one is limited to FY15 since that was the peak for agency operations, and this just shows agency operations to kind of simplify. We've consolidated several agencies into this orange bar that's just all the smaller agencies. And so I just note the trend here. There were cuts every year from FY15, 16, 17, and 18 down to about $3.86 billion of agency operations in FY18. That increased a little bit in FY19, and then the increase we see in 20 is really due to one-time spending for the COVID-19 pandemic. The governor's budget in FY22 is essentially back to that FY18 level. So the trend here was that we had 4 years of continued cuts, and then have sort of found a somewhat flat level. There were some increases that have been reversed, but it hasn't really changed from that level we hit in FY18. This next slide shows our savings balances through this period. As I mentioned, they peaked at over $16 billion in FY13. The constitutional budget reserve we project at the end of FY21 will be about $900 million. The statutory budget reserve is completely empty. And again, just going back to that CBR debt, all of those reductions to that blue bar, the CBR balance, are a constitutional debt that the general fund owes to the CBR. This next graph illustrates where the agency operations reductions have been taken. As I mentioned, we've seen significant reductions in agency operations, about 11%, about just over $500 million. However, those have not been evenly distributed across agencies. Our public protection agencies, which are corrections, law, public safety, and the court system, have actually increased by 6% since FY15. Education, the K-12 formula has been stable at the same base student allocation through this period. And as a result, there have been only minor reductions to education funding, mostly due to one-time funding in the FY15 budget that is not replicated in FY21 due to the governor's veto. So minor reductions to education. Health and social services, you see a little larger reductions, 6%, and really that reduction would be larger if not for the one-time spending due to COVID-19. But you can see there have been significant reductions there. We've talked about Medicaid reductions and others there, total about $77 million. But all of those other agencies, so everything other than the public protection, education, health and social services, are down collectively $441 million, or 35.6%. So those smaller agencies have borne the vast majority of the agency operations cuts over the past 7 years. And as a result, there's less room to continue to reduce those budgets going forward because they've already been reduced by over a third.
If you stop there for a minute, so the two middle groups, health and social services and early education, early development, those are formula driven? Take statute changes, is that correct, most of it, to get any more out of it?
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. And the K-12 formula has not been revised during this period of budget reductions, so that base student allocation is the same as it was in FY15, and the formula itself is largely unchanged as well. So moving on to our budget baselines for fiscal year 22. We developed these budget baselines to create a clean starting point for the governor's budget, rather than comparing it constantly to prior years that are often distorted by one-time items. FY 2021's budget has some COVID-19 spending in it. FY20 has significant amounts. And so if you're using those as points of comparison, it really exaggerates the impact or the changes proposed by the governor, because a lot of those are just the end of one-time items that we appropriated last year. So we created two budget baselines in order to create this cleaner point of comparison to really allow you to see the policy choices the governor's making and separate that out from those natural changes. So our two baselines are the current policy scenario and the current law scenario. So they two use the same amount for the agency operations. They use what we call the adjusted base, which for agency operations, that's typically the starting point for subcommittees, and is essentially what we use as our clean starting point for subcommittees that removes those one-time items. So the one modification we made for the current policy and current law scenarios is to also factor in changes to student counts and how that impacts the K-12 formula. That doesn't reflect a policy choice by the governor, so we don't want to either credit or blame him, depending on how you look at that funding, for that change, since it's just formula driven. The difference is in the statewide items and in the permanent fund dividend. The current policy assumption is that, like in FY21, we would appropriate a $1,000 permanent fund dividend, and there would be no UGF funding for school debt reimbursement, the REAA fund, community assistance, or oil and gas tax credits, because there was no unrestricted general funds for any of those items in the fiscal year 21 budget, largely due to the governor's vetoes. The current law assumption assumes that for statewide items we would follow the current statute. So it assumes a statutory permanent fund dividend, full funding of the school debt, REAA fund, and community assistance amounts, as well as oil and gas tax credits. And we'll have some detail on the statewide items in the next slide. So the statutory PFD is projected to be about $2 billion, paying a bit over $3,000. And the statewide items that were unfunded in fiscal year 21 are estimated to be about $168.5 million unrestricted general funds in FY22. So those are the differences you'll see between those two scenarios.
Okay, Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So in regards to the Rural Education Attendance Area Fund, the legislature fully funded those the last 2 years, and the governor vetoed it. Is that correct?
Senator Hoffman, through the chair, yes, that is correct.
So and now he has again not funded that. The problem that I have with not funding it, there was, you know, and many of the committee members may recall that is a decree to resolve the Kasaili case, you know, and at some point I think the people that are parties to that may say that we are not in compliance with the Kasaili case, and I think that issue may come up in rural Alaska, because what that does not allow is for rural schools to be built in rural Alaska, and that is a decree that the state of Alaska signed on to. So I have great heartburn with not only the veto of those 2 years of appropriation, but the non-inclusion of the rural educational attendance area funding to allow rural students the luxuries of having to go to schools that are of the quality that many urban schools have. So I plan on checking with those school districts to find out what is happening and is there under consideration saying that the state of Alaska is not in compliance with the Kasaili case. And I'm pretty sure since the decree was issued and the state of Alaska signed off on that, the state of Alaska is not in compliance with that decree.
Thank you, Senator Hoffman. The other thing I'd like to add is we've got a moratorium on school construction. So that's had a 5-year extension off of 5 years. So we've got a whole issue that I think the committee needs to talk about. School construction, debt reimbursement, both school construction in urban and rural areas. So we'll have to have a hearing on that as we go forward sometime. Go ahead and continue.
So this next slide, slide 11, shows the statewide items in comparison to each other between these two scenarios. The difference in the debt service amount is due to the municipal project debt that the governor vetoed in both the FY20 and 21 budgets that the legislature had appropriated. So there's a difference between the current policy of not funding those versus the current law. School debt reimbursement, again, in FY21, the governor vetoed all funding, so that's the current policy assumption. Current law assumes that we would fully fund that. And note, this is just the UGF amount. There's also designated general funds that the governor is proposing to put towards that program. There's no difference in the state retirement payments. We already talked about the REA fund capitalization, but again, there's a difference there. The governor last year vetoed a supplemental to community assistance. The FY21 deposit was made wholly from the PCE program. So we would consider the current policy would be no unrestricted general funds to that, only PCE. And the current law would be, really there's two possibilities here because the current statute gives you two options, but this is just assuming the amount needed to get up to a $30 million deposit total. The statute actually says that it could be either the amount to do a 30 million deposit or the amount to get up to a $90 million fund balance. That would be adding roughly another 30 million to that appropriation to get up to that level. So we picked the lower of the two since it's closer to what we've been doing, but again, the statute allows for either appropriation. For oil and gas tax credits, again, we did not appropriate an amount for that in FY21. And the statutory calculation in FY22 is 60 million. So that's the difference between the two scenarios there. And then adding them all up, this shows that for agency operations, our baseline is about 3.9 billion. So that's actually lower than the FY21 budget because of the one-time items. The statewide items, there's the difference we already saw. We would assume that a baseline capital budget is about 150 million. That's where it's been over the past 6 years or so. The FY21 capital budget was a little lower, but it wasn't complete because of the early end of session. And again, the change in the dividend. So the bottom line here is that, excuse me, if we held to the current policy assumption, we'd have a deficit of about $900 million. If we went with the current law assumption, we'd have a deficit in FY22 of about $2.4 billion.
And just as a reminder, how is the dividend calculated in each one of these two scenarios?
Mr. Chairman, the current policy assumption is that the dividend would be the same appropriation made in FY21. So that was a roughly $1,000 dividend, costs $680 million. The current law assumption is that we would follow the statute, which is just over $2 billion. So here's how the governor's budget compares to those assumptions. So in agency operations, the governor's budget is down 77.4 million below our current law and current policy assumptions. And we'll talk about those areas of reduction in the next few slides. In statewide items, the governor is above the current policy assumption, but below the current law assumption. The governor does have 50% funding for the school debt and REAA, but does not use UGF for tax credits. And again, there's a difference in the community assistance as well. The capital budget, the governor's budget is significantly below that, below our assumption. That's due to the bonding proposal with using the Alaska Housing Finance Corporation. Again, we'll cover that in the next few slides. The governor has the statutory dividend, so that shows up as an increase versus current policy, the same as current law. So I would just note that before the dividend, the governor is about $140 million below current policy and about $300 million below current law. After the dividend, the governor is about $1.2 billion above current policy, but still that $300 million below current law. And as you've at this point heard quite several times, the governor's budget includes a supplemental PFD payment for FY21, which is a $1.2 billion draw from the ERA on top of the ERA draws we already took for the percent of market value draw. It takes two separate ERA draws in FY22. There's the $3.1 billion POMV payment, and then an additional $2 billion for the statutory dividend. And then his budget submission also includes a fast-track supplemental budget. The deadline for supplementals is, I believe, tomorrow, so we could expect some additional supplemental items from the governor at that point. And the governor's budget has an estimated about $50 million deficit from the CBR, even after that second ERA draw for the dividend. So there's still a CBR draw, and you may note this is slightly different from what OMB presented. The biggest difference is that they built in a piece of legislation that with an estimated amount, and then they introduced a subsequent fiscal note that turned out to have slightly less savings. So in agency operations, where the governor's down $77.4 million, the OMB director just went through most of those changes, but the largest one is the reduction in Medicaid of $35.1 million. However, as we just discussed, the total funding is actually basically flat because of carrying forward one-time funding from FY21. The University of Alaska is down $20 million. Again, that's the last year of the compact agreement. The Department of Transportation and Public Facilities is down $17 million. Part of that is the reduction to the marine highway system, and the remainder is primarily due to the one-time use of Federal CARES Act money to offset general funds. Public assistance is the largest other cut we see in the governor's budget. It's down about $3.4 million and 101 positions. The K-12 formula is fully funded in the governor's budget, but the student count changes that are projected by districts result in a lower funding projection. That is included in our baseline. All of the other changes we see across the agencies result in a net $1.7 million reduction, and my colleague at OMB has already covered a lot of those. However, the vast majority of the changes are really these first three items. So these statewide items total $464.1 million. School debt reimbursement and REAA are funded at 50% of the statutory level. Community assistance is funded with $12.4 million of PCE funds, which is a DGF source, and no UGF. That leads to a payout to community assistance recipients in FY23 of about $19.5 million. Just a note on that, in FY21, the base payments to municipalities in that totaled about $19.7 million. So essentially that level of funding pays out the base payments, but it would not pay out any per capita payments. And our projection is that there would be a slight proration of those base payments, although it's pretty hard to notice the difference between that. The oil and gas tax credits in the governor's budget are funded at the statutory $60 million. However, they use ADA receipts rather than UGF, so that doesn't show up in the UGF category, but it is funded as a non-designated use of ADA receipts. that was proposed, or there have been proposals over the last couple of years to use ADA receipts for items like oil and gas tax credits or other non-designated items. For transparency's sake, LFD would recommend that if the legislature wants to take money from ADA, that it should not be used to artificially lower the size of the budget. That really just distorts the size of the budget. This item has no statutory relation to ADA, and so using this fund code really just hides the true size of the budget. And in statewide items, the governor also introduced a PERS bill, Senate Bill 55, that's estimated to save a net of $31.3 million of unrestricted general funds by changing the calculation of the cap on PERS for state employees. The governor's capital budget totals $58.5 million of unrestricted general funds, which may seem very low. However, it's bolstered by a $101.6 million bond package through AHFC. Repaying those bonds would not come as a payment to our state budget. It would be paid by AHFC. That would reduce AHFC dividends to the state. Those are an unrestricted general fund revenue source. It would reduce those payments to the state by somewhere between $6 and $7 million a year. We've heard different numbers from different members of the administration. The governor also plans a $350 million general obligation bond. However, there has been no legislation introduced yet or idea of the projects, and the cost of that bond has not yet been determined. It is not in the governor's 10-year plan, the debt service on that. So if you're looking at the governor's 10-year plan, you may want to add whatever that projection is, but it's not in there right now. The governor's fast track supplemental includes some of the unfunded FY21 capital projects. So you may recall last session, we rolled part of the capital budget into the operating budget, but not the entire thing. Some of those were unfunded projects, ended up receiving RPLs in August of 2020. That funded a portion of them. Some are funded in the fast track supplemental, and then others are funded in the FY22 budget through increased appropriations in that year. So for the most part, those missing items are funded in one of these three places. There are a few that are not funded there, but often for good reason, such as there was a University of Alaska project that ended up being funded with a different source when they got a federal grant. This next slide, slide 18, shows the short fiscal summary of the governor's budget. So starting up with agency operations, you can see that the governor's agency operations are down nearly $200 million from FY21. The difference between that and our baselines are really those one-time items related to COVID-19. So, sometimes you hear people say, well, the governor's proposing to cut the budget by $450 million. Really, that's building in a lot of these natural reductions. And so we wouldn't really count those as a budget cut. And that's why we have these other baselines to provide a cleaner point of comparison, so we don't exaggerate the size of the governor's reductions. Statewide items are up $17.8 million. That's primarily due to the 50% funding of school debt and REA versus no funding last year. Capital budget is down significantly for the reasons we already discussed. So the bottom line is that the governor is showing a $242.6 million reduction from last year's budget. But again, a lot of that is just these one-time items coming out. In the permanent fund dividend, the governor's budget is up compared to last year, using the statutory amount by about $1.3 billion. The governor's fiscal summary includes the savings from the PERS legislation of $31.3 million. The governor subsequently introduced an education bill that actually increases funding by about $35 million, but he did not include that in his fiscal summary. Arguably, we could just cross this line out because those two kind of cancel out. But again, we're trying to reflect their fiscal summary that only includes the bill that saves money, not the bill that increases funding. So the bottom line is that, again, a $1.1 billion increase in the governor's budget compared to last year, because of the increase, primarily that increase to the permanent fund dividend. The governor's supplementals in FY21 do increase that year's budget. There's $39.8 million of supplementals other than the dividend, and then $1.2 billion for that supplemental dividend. If you include that, then the comparison would be that the governor's budget is down. But again, that's counting his supplementals, so a bit of a misleading comparison. So the bottom line, the total deficit is about $2.1 billion each year. In FY21, that would be met by an additional draw from the ERA, as well as the deficit from the CBR, about $900 million that's already been appropriated. In FY22, that would be again filled with $2 billion from the ERA and then about $50 million from the Constitutional Budget Reserve. So, as the chairman noted earlier, the governor's budget builds in several UGF reductions that may be difficult to repeat or may be kind of a one-time reduction. There's the $35 million of lapsing balances that are being used for Medicaid that allows the FY22 budget to really be smaller than the true amount that we expect to be spent on Medicaid in the year. There's the $14.1 million of one-time fund changes in DOT. With the most recent federal stimulus bill, there are additional federal funds coming into DOT for a longer period. However, it's unclear, those are highway funds versus airport funds, so they may be for different purposes. So it's kind of unclear whether this $14.1 million of one-time fund changes are something that can be sustained for a few years with these federal funds that are coming in or not. That we'll probably get some more clarity on in the governor's amended budget in a couple of weeks. There's the $60 million of ADA receipts for tax credits. I suppose it would be possible to build that in year on year and eventually draw the full $700 million of tax credits from ADA, but I don't know that if that's what the governor's really suggesting long term, but we would consider that to be kind of a one-time budget maneuver. And again, these AHFC bonds, it reduces the size of the FY22 budget. However, that funding mechanism cannot be utilized repeatedly, so it's really a one-time savings. So if you add those up, it's about $200 million of sort of one-time budget maneuvers to reduce the size of the FY22 budget. And if you didn't have these built in, the governor's budget would actually be fairly flat from FY21 to FY22 for operations and the capital budget. Moving on to the governor's 10-year plan. So we've talked about the ERA overdraws. The governor's 10-year plan just shows those as kind of a one-time maneuver here in FY21 and FY22. And the governor's 10-year plan calls for a balanced budget starting next year. The primary way that happens in the governor's budget plan is that $900 million to $1.2 billion of new revenue would start in fiscal year 23. He doesn't specify where that revenue is coming from. And another reduction or another deficit filling measure is the dividend reduction from the 50% of statutory net income in the current law to 50% of the percent of market value draw starting in FY23. That's a reduction on average of about $400 million a year going forward. The governor is building in agency operations reductions of about $100 million each in FY23 and 24, and then limiting growth to about 1.5%. That's below the rate of inflation. And so the result is that in the governor's plan, we'd go from about $3.8 billion of agency operations spending in FY22 to $3.7 billion and then $3.6 billion in FY24, and then grow at 1.5% from there. So those ERA overdraws come at a cost of future earnings in the permanent fund. There's a variety of ways to calculate that impact. To me, the simplest way is just to take the percent of market value draw as 5%, and therefore 5% of those $3.2 billion of overdraws is $160 million a year. And because of the inflation, the built-in inflation adjustment, that essentially is the inflation-adjusted deficit increase caused by those $3.2 billion of overdraws. So in real terms, the future deficits will be larger by $160 million a year as a result of those overdraws. And that requires additional action to close future deficits. So you as a legislature have to weigh the benefits of the stimulus spending that those represent, that the governor talked about in the State of the State, versus that long-term cost. You know, it does have a short-term benefit to the economy, but it would increase our future deficits. The governor also is calling for new revenue. In order to have new revenue starting in FY23, that really is a discussion that would need to take place this year. Given the length of time to enact a new tax or, you know, fully consider changes to petroleum taxes, that discussion would have to happen now. It would be very difficult to put that off till next session if that's truly the target is, you know, roughly $1 billion in new revenue a year. That is a, even doing it this session is optimistic because that would require starting, say, a broad-based tax in the middle of a calendar year on July 1st. Usually that would be rolled out on, you know, January 1st, so it's a full year, and that would just reduce the revenue in the first year of implementation. The policy choices that the legislature and governor make and how to fill the deficit will have different impacts on the economy. If you decide to have more stimulus spending up front, that'll have an economic positive now, but will you know, cause a future reduction, future larger deficit that would have to be filled from somewhere that could then hurt the economy in future years. Adopting a reduction to the permanent fund dividend versus a new tax, a new income or sales tax, would have different impacts on Alaskans with different income levels or different areas of the state. And that's something that the legislature should take into account as you are making your decisions about how to close the deficit. If you agree to the overdraws this year without taking the deficit filling measures that the governor suggests in the 10-year plan, the ERA could easily go the same way as the CBR and SBR, where we have continued structural deficits that would be drawn out of it, and it could be rapidly depleted despite the significant balance now. Every year we delay resolving that long-term deficit digs the hole deeper because, again, every time we draw from the ERA, that's going to reduce the earning power of the fund. Some have said that, you know, right now the permanent fund has performed well and therefore, you know, we can safely draw extra from the fund. However, the point of the percent of market value draw is to even the market volatility out. Last March, the fund went down to 60 billion, but there was no real worry that we wouldn't be able to make our percent of market value payment because we had enough in the earnings reserve that we could keep doing that. There was no discussion that we're going to have to reduce the ERA draw now because we're kind of in this for the long term. So unless if we get to where we don't have that ERA buffer, and where we're spending on the high but not reducing our spending in the low, that's going to increase our volatility going forward. Sticking to the POMV draw provides more stability. Again, there may be reasons that right now with the global pandemic that there's a reason to, you know, break that rule, but it is important to say that simply because there's more revenue available does not mean that it's cost-free to draw that. You know, that's kind of similar to what happened, you know, in prior years where we had fast budget growth when oil revenue was high. You know, members of this committee and the two former chairmen, or current and former chairman here, may remember there was also a concerted effort to save because we knew that that revenue wouldn't last forever. And so similarly with the permanent fund, if you just spend the highs and don't cut in the low, you're going to overspend over time. So following the percent of market value draw is how you keep that revenue flowing forever. And with that said, that's all I have. Not many questions, so got through pretty quick. Happy to answer any more questions now.
I'd like to just make one note, thinking back when we have worked on the retirement system over the years. One of the areas that got the retirement plan, particularly TERS, in trouble is when they had a couple of strong financial years, they basically took the cream off the top, and you still are exposed to down markets. And you can't, in good years, take the cream off the top and think you're not going to get the averages working against you then through bear markets. And the permanent fund is no different. So we've made that mistake before back in the 80s, dealing with TERS in the early 90s. I think we need to be very careful we don't make that same mistake again with the permanent fund. And we have no other backstop. So the stakes are pretty high. Do we have any questions for the OMB director before we let him off the hot seat? I think just another quick comment. On the second to the last slide about the 900 to 1.2 billion in new revenue starting in 23, I think it'd be more applicable to mark that down as a deficit, because there is no discussion of any magnitude of new revenues. So, Senator Hoffman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would request that, it's a simple calculation, but if we could get what the average of the permanent fund dividend has been since its inception, I think that would give the committee some sort of benchmark of how much the state of Alaska has been paying on an annual basis with that average.
We'll have the permanent fund in front of us, and we'll have them show that. I'm also going to have them calculate the dividend, what it would have been if the state didn't reinvest its 50%. So 50% went to the dividend, the state's 50% was just reinvested. So that accelerated the growth of the permanent fund. So we'll factor that out also for information. And then we'll have to your point of the historic dividends, it's been quite a few years, so we'll have them inflation proofed also, inflation adjusted. So you can't use 20-year-old dollars or 30-year-old dollars without inflation adjusting it for any type of purchasing parity. So we'll have that stuff done, and any other views that committee members want, we'll have that stuff packaged up, and we'll have the permanent fund later in the week, I think, here, and we'll start that conversation with them. And also, if there's ad hoc draws, what kind of management repercussions does it have on their portfolio strategies? And I think you'll find it might be significant. We have any other comments? We're done a little earlier than I thought we'd be today. So, seeing none, I'd like to thank the OMB director for coming forward. Tomorrow, we'll have a brief Eddie's. We say here. Tomorrow will be the Department of Revenue. We're going to talk about the savings accounts, budget reserves, and that'll tie into the burn rate that we're very concerned about here. Why we need to get this solution fixed, or before it fixes us, the problem fixes us, I should say. And then we're going to also start talking about state debt, the current schedule, what we are looking at, and then if we applied other debt, additional debt. And that's kind of a prelude to the conversation we'll have with the capital budget and the interest in a bond package or any other debt that may be applied to the state. So those conversations will start tomorrow, 9 a.m. Thanks everybody for coming. We are adjourned.
Thank you all for joining us here today. Sorry about the really poor feed. Something is going on. Lost all sound just a little while ago. Now it's stopping and starting and won't stay consistent.
Senator Von Imhoff to add the
Senator Natasha Von Imhoff, as you are hearing behind me, she definitely wants to make sure that Alaskans get to see that they want to use our permanent fund dividend as part of the budget. That is why she had insisted that it get put onto the graph. This is just absolutely disgusting. I am sorry that you had to see that. People, please get on the phone. Call her.
So
Call
we're
all our
looking at
legislators. Tell them to
on
stop
the
using our
line
permanent
from
fund dividend.
21 to
Thank you all for
22.
joining us here today. I will re-upload this later. At 1:30 today, we have SB 39. This is the election integrity and all the things that they are planning on doing with that. And it'll definitely be worth watching. They are going to be taking testimonies today. This begins at 1:30. Thanks for tuning in.